Welcome, weary traveller, to Sleepless Survivors. Tonight, we journey together through the mists of ancient time to a world where gods walked among mortals, where mighty cities rose from the desert sands, and where the boundaries between myth and history blur into shadows. Let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax. As you listen to this tale of the Anunnaki, allow yourself to drift on currents of ancient wonder. There is no need to remember every detail. Simply let the words wash over you like waves upon a timeless shore. Our story begins more than 5,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers. Chapter 1. The Land Between Rivers. Close your eyes and imagine. The sun rises over Mesopotamia, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Two great rivers flow through this fertile land, the Tigris and the Euphrates, bringing life to the desert, transforming barren earth into gardens of extraordinary abundance. This is the cradle of civilization. Here, humanity first learned to cultivate crops in organized fashion, to build cities of mud, brick and stone, to record their thoughts in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets. Here, the earliest stories were told, the first laws were written, the primordial myths of creation were sung beneath star-filled skies. The people of ancient Sumer, the earliest known civilization in this region, looked up at the heavens and wondered. They watched the sun trace its path across the vault of sky. They observed the moon waxing and waning through its eternal cycle. They noticed how certain stars seemed to wander against the backdrop of the others, the planets, moving in mysterious patterns that surely held meaning. And they created stories to explain what they saw, stories of powerful beings who shaped the world, who controlled the forces of nature, who decided the fates of mortals. These beings were called by many names, but one name would echo through millennia, the Anunnaki. The word itself carries weight. Anunnaki. Say it slowly. Let it roll across your tongue. In the Sumerian language, it can be broken into parts. Anu, referring to the sky god, the father of the gods, and Koi, relating to earth or the earthly realm. The Anunnaki were, in essence, those who came from heaven to earth, the offspring of sky and earth, divine beings dwelling in the realm of mortals. But who were they really? What did the ancient Sumerians believe about these entities? And why do their stories continue to fascinate us today, thousands of years after the last cuneiform tablet was pressed into wet clay? Let your mind drift back through time, back through the centuries, back through the millennia, back to a world lit only by fire and starlight, where every natural phenomenon was imbued with divine presence, where the gods were not distant abstractions but immediate, present forces that shaped daily life. Chapter 2. The ancient texts speak. The priests of ancient Sumer were scribes and scholars. They spent years learning the complex cuneiform script, mastering the art of pressing reed styluses into clay tablets to create permanent records. And what they recorded was extraordinary. Not merely mundane matters of trade and taxation, though those too were documented, but grand epic poems, creation myths, hymns to the gods, and king lists that stretched back to a time before the Great Flood. One of the most important texts, one that speaks extensively of the Anunnaki, is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Picture a clay tablet in dim lamplight, a priest reading aloud the ancient words, his voice echoing through a temple chamber. The story begins in primordial times, when only water existed. Two beings emerge from these cosmic waters, Apsu, the fresh water, sweet and life-giving, and Tiamat, the salt water, bitter and vast as the ocean. These two forces mingled, and from their union the first gods were born. But these younger gods were noisy, active, disturbing the peace of the primordial waters. Apsu grew angry with their clamour and sought to destroy them, but before he could act, he was slain by Ea, one of the younger gods, who was wise and clever beyond measure. Tiamat, enraged by the death of Apsu, resolved to take revenge. She created an army of monsters and demons, terrible creatures to wage war against the younger gods. The gods were afraid, uncertain how to face such a threat until one among them stepped forward, Marduk, son of Ea, young and mighty and eager to prove his strength. Marduk agreed to face Tiamat but demanded a price. If he defeated her, he would become king of all the gods, his word would be law, his authority absolute. The gods, desperate, agreed. The battle was cosmic in scope. Marduk armed himself with winds and storms, with lightning and flood. He caught Tiamat in a net, drove winds into her mouth so she could not close her jaws, then pierced her heart with an arrow. When she died, he split her body in two, like a shellfish. From one half, he created the heavens. From the other half, the earth. But Marduk was not finished with his act of creation. The gods still needed servants, beings to perform the labour of maintaining the world, to till the fields and build the temples, to make offerings and sing praises. And so, from the blood of Chingu, Tiamat's commander and consort, Marduk fashioned humanity. In this ancient view, humans were created specifically to serve the gods, to free the Anunnaki from toil. We were not made in some grand gesture of love or creative joy, but out of practical necessity. Divine beings needed servants, and so humanity came into existence. This is a sobering thought, perhaps, but do not let it disturb your rest. These are ancient stories born from an ancient world view, attempting to explain the human condition as it was understood thousands of years ago. Simply let the words flow past you, like a river flowing toward the sea. Chapter 3. The Council of Gods. In Sumerian and Babylonian mythology, the universe was governed not by a single all-powerful deity, but by a council of gods, a divine assembly where decisions were debated, judgments were rendered, and the fate of the cosmos was determined. At the head of this council sat Anu, whose name means simply sky or heaven. He was the father of the gods, the supreme authority, dwelling in the highest heaven. But like many kings, Anu delegated much of his authority to others, preferring to reign from a distance while his children and grandchildren managed the day-to-day affairs of the cosmos. Next in the hierarchy came Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm. Enlil was the king of the gods in practical terms, the executive authority who carried out the will of the divine council. He was associated with the wind, with storms, with the breath of life itself. His word was law. His anger was terrible to behold. Many of the most important decisions in Mesopotamian mythology flow from Enlil. Then there was Enki, also called Ea, god of wisdom, of fresh water, of magic and crafts. Enki was clever where Enlil was powerful, subtle where Enlil was direct. He was the god who taught humanity the arts of civilization, how to build cities, how to practice law, how to heal the sick and irrigate the fields. In many stories, Enki appears as a friend to humanity, protecting mortals from the harsh decrees of the other gods. These three, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, formed the supreme triad of the Anunnaki. But there were many others: Ninhursag, the mother goddess; Inanna, goddess of love and war; Utu, the sun god who saw all things; Nanna, the moon god who measured time. Each had their own sphere of influence, their own temples, their own priests and devotees. The Anunnaki gathered in assembly, debating the great questions of existence. Should humanity be allowed to multiply across the earth? Should they be punished for their transgressions? Should civilization be allowed to flourish, or should it be swept away by flood and disaster? Imagine this council meeting in some cosmic chamber, these powerful beings arguing and deliberating, while far below, on the earth they had created, humanity went about its daily business, unaware that its fate hung in the balance. The tablets tell us that there were 300 Anunnaki assigned to the heavens, and another 300 assigned to the earth and the underworld. Together, 600 divine beings maintained the order of the cosmos, each with specific duties and responsibilities. But the tablets also hint at something else, at tensions and conflicts within this divine hierarchy, at younger gods chafing under the authority of the older generation, at labour disputes and rebellions that would reshape the relationship between gods and mortals. Chapter 4. The Rebellion and the Creation of Humanity. Let us turn now to one of the most fascinating stories in the Mesopotamian tradition, the story of why humanity was created, as told in the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest flood narratives in human literature. According to this ancient text, in the beginning, the Anunnaki were divided into two groups: the great gods, who supervised, and the lesser gods, called the Igigi, who laboured. The Igigi were assigned the task of digging out the rivers and canals, of maintaining the waterways that would bring life to the land. They worked for thousands of years, digging with their own hands, never resting, never knowing peace. Imagine their exhaustion. Picture these divine beings covered in mud, bent over their work, digging, always digging, while the great gods reclined in comfort. Can you feel their frustration building, year after year, century after century? Finally they could endure no more. The Igigi cast down their tools, burned their implements, and marched on the house of Enlil in the middle of the night. They surrounded his dwelling and declared they would labour no more. They demanded relief from their endless toil. The great gods were disturbed by this revolt. They held an assembly to discuss what should be done. Anu suggested they might simply destroy the rebels, but Enki, wise as always, proposed a different solution: create a new being, a mortal being, to bear the labour instead. And so humanity was fashioned. From clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god, one of the rebels, perhaps, sacrificed for the good of the whole. Enki and Ninhursag created the first humans. 7 males and 7 females, formed from divine materials but mortal in nature, destined to live brief lives, to age and die, to be replaced by their offspring in an endless cycle of generations. The Igigi were freed from their labour. Humanity took up the burden instead, tilling the fields, digging the canals, building the temples, making offerings to the gods who had created them. In this ancient worldview, work was not a punishment for sin, as in some later traditions, but the very purpose for which humanity existed. We were made to serve. Our labour sustained the gods, who in return provided order, protection, and the blessings of civilization. It is a transactional relationship, perhaps, but also an intimate one. The gods depended on humanity just as humanity depended on the gods. Each needed the other. The offerings that rose from temple altars fed the divine beings. The blessings that flowed from the heavens sustained mortal life. Consider this symbiosis as you drift towards sleep. Gods and mortals, each playing their role in the great cosmic drama, each dependent on the other for survival and flourishing. Chapter 5. The Great Flood. But humanity multiplied. The earth filled with people. Cities grew larger, noisier, more crowded. The sounds of human activity rose up to the heavens. The shouts of merchants in the marketplace, the songs of labourers in the fields, the cries of children at play, the constant hum and buzz and clamour of civilization. Enlil, Lord of the earth, could not rest. The noise disturbed him. He tossed and turned in his heavenly dwelling, kept awake by the endless racket from below. He became angry, irritated, finally enraged. He decided to reduce the human population. First, he sent plague. Disease swept through the cities and many died. But the survivors multiplied again, and soon the noise was as loud as before. Then Enlil sent drought. The rain ceased, the rivers dwindled, crops withered in the fields, famine stalked the land, many more died. But again, the survivors persevered, and in time the earth was full of people once more. Finally, Enlil resolved to destroy humanity entirely. He would send a great flood, a deluge that would sweep away every living thing, that would cleanse the earth of the noisy, troublesome creatures who had disturbed his peace. The other gods agreed to this plan, swearing an oath to keep it secret from humanity. But Enki, who had helped create the first humans, who had taught them the arts of civilization, could not bear to see his handiwork destroyed. He could not break his oath directly. He could not simply tell a human what was coming. But he was clever, and he found a way around his promise. He spoke to the reed wall of a house where a righteous man named Atrahasis lived. He told the reed wall all about the coming flood, speaking loudly enough that anyone inside the house would certainly hear. Atrahasis did hear. He understood the warning. And on Enki's advice he built a great boat, a vessel large enough to hold his family and representatives of all living creatures. He stocked it with provisions and sealed it against the waters. Then the flood came. Picture the sky darkening, storm clouds gathering from every direction, the first drops of rain beginning to fall, then a downpour, water cascading from the heavens in torrents, the rivers overflowing their banks, the land disappearing beneath the rising waters. For 7 days and 7 nights the rain fell. The entire world was covered. Everything that lived on dry land perished. Cities were drowned. Fields vanished beneath the flood. The great works of civilization disappeared as if they had never been. Only Atrahasis and those in his boat survived. floating on the endless waters, alone on a drowned planet. Finally, the rains ceased. The waters began to recede. The boat came to rest on a mountain peak. Atrahasis sent out birds to search for dry land. First a dove, which returned finding no place to perch, then a swallow, which also returned, and finally a raven, which did not come back, a sign that the waters had retreated enough for life to return. Atrahasis left the boat and made an offering to the gods, a sacrifice of thanksgiving for his survival. The smell of the roasting meat rose up to the heavens, and the gods, who had been deprived of offerings during the flood, gathered around it like flies, hungry and eager. Enlil was furious when he discovered that humans had survived. He raged at the assembly, demanding to know who had warned them, but the other gods defended Enki's actions. They pointed out that humanity, while noisy, was also necessary. Who would make offerings if all mortals perished? Who would maintain the temples and sing the hymns of praise? Finally, a compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but its numbers would be limited. Not all women would be able to bear children. Some babies would die in infancy. Natural predators and diseases would keep the population in check. Death would become a constant companion to human life, ensuring that the noise of civilization would never again grow so great as to disturb the sleep of the gods. And so the world was remade, humanity given a second chance, but under new conditions. The relationship between mortals and immortals was redefined, with both sides now understanding the limits and necessities of their mutual existence. This story of the flood appears in many variations across Mesopotamian literature. The name of the hero changes, sometimes Atrahasis, sometimes Utnapishtim, sometimes Ziusudra. The details vary, but the core narrative remains constant: humanity nearly destroyed, saved by the compassion of one god, preserved to serve the divine assembly. Chapter 6. Cities of Wonder. Now let us turn from myth to the physical world, from stories told around ancient fires to the ruins that still stand in the desert sands, silent testimony to the grandeur of Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, these ancient peoples built cities of extraordinary sophistication. Massive urban centres housed tens of thousands of people, organised into complex social hierarchies, supported by agriculture and trade networks that stretched across thousands of miles. Consider Uruk, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. At its height, around 2900 BCE, Uruk may have been the largest city on Earth, home to perhaps 50,000 people, an enormous population for that era. Its walls stretched for nearly 6 miles in circumference, encompassing an area of over 2 square miles. According to legend, these walls were built by Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king, whose own epic would become one of the foundational texts of world literature. Within those walls rose temples to the gods, particularly to Inanna, goddess of love and war, the patron deity of Uruk. The White Temple, built on a massive raised platform called a ziggurat, towered over the city, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Imagine the impression this would make on travellers approaching the city. This gleaming white structure rising from the earth like a mountain, a stairway between heaven and earth, a dwelling place for the gods. The ziggurat was not merely a temple, but a cosmic symbol, representing the primordial mound that first emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. To climb its stairs was to ascend from the earthly realm toward the divine, to approach the boundary between mortal and immortal spheres. Priests maintained these temples, performing daily rituals to feed and clothe the statues of the gods, which were believed to house the actual presence of the divine beings. Every morning, the statue would be awakened with hymns and prayers. It would be washed, anointed with oil, dressed in fine garments, and offered meals of bread, beer, meat, and fruit. In the evening, it would be prepared for sleep. The gods, in this understanding, were physically present in their temples, dwelling among their people, requiring care and attention just as any important person would. Or consider Babylon, the city that would give its name to an entire empire. Under Nebuchadnezzar Sekur around 600 BCE, Babylon reached the height of its glory. The city was rebuilt on a massive scale, with enormous walls, according to Herodotus, though his numbers may be exaggerated, wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other on top. The Ishtar Gate, decorated with glazed bricks depicting dragons and bulls in vivid blue and yellow, welcomed visitors to the city. The processional way led from this gate to the Temple of Marduk in the city centre, and there was the ziggurat of Babylon, called Anunnaki in Sumerian, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. This structure may have stood nearly 300 feet high, a stepped pyramid rising in 7 tiers, each painted a different colour, topped with a shrine to Marduk himself. Some scholars believe this ziggurat inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, though of course the Mesopotamians would have had a very different understanding of its purpose. To them, it was not an act of hubris, but of piety, a sacred link between earth and heaven, built according to divine instructions, a place where gods and mortals could meet. Picture yourself standing at the base of such a structure in the ancient world. Tilt your head back and look up. See how it rises toward the sky, its summit lost in the clouds on a misty morning. Feel how small you seem in comparison, how vast and powerful the gods must be if this is merely the foundation of their dwelling. These cities were not just religious centres, but hubs of commerce and culture. Scribal schools taught the art of writing. Libraries preserved thousands of clay tablets, legal documents, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, medical texts, literature and myth. Markets bustled with merchants selling goods from distant lands. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia, textiles and spices from Arabia and beyond. The sophistication of Mesopotamian urban planning is remarkable. Cities had drainage systems, paved streets, defensive walls, administrative centres. Some scholars argue that the very concept of civilization, of organised, literate urban society, began here, in the land between the rivers, under the watchful eyes of the Anunnaki. Chapter 7. The King Lists and Antediluvian Rulers. Among the most intriguing documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia are the Sumerian King Lists, tablets that attempt to record every ruler who ever sat on a throne in Sumer from the beginning of time to the period when the tablets were written. These King Lists begin with an extraordinary statement. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In the Mesopotamian worldview, political authority did not arise from human society but was a divine gift, literally lowered from the realm of the gods to the realm of mortals. Kings ruled by divine appointment, as representatives of the gods, mediating between heaven and earth. But what makes the King List truly fascinating are the fantastical reign lengths attributed to the earliest rulers, the kings who reigned before the Great Flood. Consider these examples from the text. Alulim, the first king who ruled in Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Aljab, ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana reigned for 43,200 years. Dumuzid, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues in this manner, recording 8 kings who ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over the land and everything changed. After the flood, kingship was again lowered from heaven, this time to the city of Kish. But the post-flood kings had much shorter reigns, measured in hundreds or dozens of years rather than tens of thousands. As the list moves forward in time, the reign lengths continue to decrease, gradually approaching normal human lifespans, until we reach the historical period where the rulers can be verified through other sources, and their reigns are indeed measured in decades rather than centuries or millennia. What are we to make of these extraordinary numbers? Scholars have proposed many interpretations. Perhaps they are symbolic rather than literal, representing the glory and power of the antediluvian age, a golden age when gods and mortals mingled more freely. Perhaps they reflect a different calendrical system. Some suggest the years might actually represent months or seasons, though even this adjustment doesn't fully reconcile the numbers with human lifespans. Or perhaps these kings were not entirely human. Perhaps they were the offspring of the Anunnaki and mortals, semi-divine beings who partook of immortal nature enough to live for vast spans of time, but were still subject to eventual death. The king lists speak of a time fundamentally different from our own, an age when the rules of nature operated differently, when the boundary between divine and mortal was more permeable, when the Anunnaki walked openly on the earth and kings were their direct representatives, if not their actual children. One of these early kings is particularly significant, Enmerkar, king of Uruk, who according to later texts built the city's great walls and warred against the distant city of Arata. Enmerkar's name may mean the hunter, and some scholars have noted similarities to the biblical Nimrod, described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, who built cities in Mesopotamia. Whether there is any actual connection remains debated, but it demonstrates how these ancient traditions echoed across cultures, how the memory of extraordinary rulers in the distant past was preserved in many forms. Another name demands attention: Dumuzi, also known as Tammuz, who appears in the king list as a ruler of Bad Tabira. Dumuzi would become the protagonist of some of Mesopotamia's most poignant myths, a shepherd god, lover of Inanna, who died and descended to the underworld. His death and resurrection became the subject of annual religious festivals, marking the changing of the seasons, the death and rebirth of vegetation. In later traditions, he would be remembered as a dying and rising god, a figure of sacrifice and renewal. The king lists also preserve the names of historical rulers whose existence can be verified through archaeological evidence. Enmebarajesi of Kish, Gilgamesh of Uruk, Masanapada of Ur. These were real kings who ruled real cities around 2600-2500 BCE. Yet even these historical figures are surrounded by legendary material, their deeds magnified in later retellings, their relationships with the gods emphasized. This blending of history and myth is characteristic of ancient Mesopotamian thought. The past was not divided into neat categories of factual and mythological. Rather, all of history was understood as the unfolding of divine plans, with gods and mortals acting together in the great drama of existence. Every king was chosen by the gods. Every battle was won or lost according to divine will. Every city flourished or fell based on the favour or anger of the Anunnaki. As you listen to these ancient names, let them flow past like water over stones. Alulim, Alaljar, Enmenluana, Enmerkar, Gilgamesh. Each was once a living being, whether entirely human or something more, who looked up at the same moon we see, who wondered about their place in the cosmos, who eventually passed into dust and memory, leaving only their names pressed into clay. Chapter 8. Eridu, the first city. Among all the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, one holds a special place in the mythological tradition. Eridu, claimed by the Sumerians to be the first city ever built, the place where civilization itself began. Imagine the landscape in primordial times. The Persian Gulf extended much farther north than it does today. Where there is now desert, there were once marshlands, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers met the sea. In this liminal space between river and ocean, between fresh water and salt water, the city of Eridu was founded. According to myth, Eridu was the city of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. It was here that Enki had his temple, the Abzu, the house of the cosmic underground ocean of fresh water that was believed to underlie the entire world. Enki dwelt in these deep waters, which were the source of all rivers, all springs, all life-giving moisture. Archaeological excavations at the site known as Tel Abu Shahrain, identified as ancient Eridu, have revealed a sequence of temples built one atop another, spanning more than 2,000 years. The earliest temple, a small shrine built around 5000 BCE, is one of the oldest religious structures ever discovered in Mesopotamia. Over centuries, this temple was rebuilt and enlarged multiple times, each new structure more impressive than the last, until finally a massive ziggurat rose on this spot, honouring Enki, the god who had dwelt here since the beginning of time. The Sumerians believed that Eridu was where kingship first descended from heaven. Here the arts of civilization were first practiced. Here humanity learned to organize into urban communities, to practice agriculture on a large scale, to worship the gods in proper fashion. The Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary creation text, tells how the gods created humanity, how cities were established, and how civilization flourished under divine guidance. But the text also describes how humanity grew too numerous, too noisy, leading to the decision to send the flood, a version of the story we have already explored. What makes Eridu particularly significant is that it seems to represent a memory of the actual origin of Mesopotamian civilization. While the myth places it at the beginning of time, archaeology suggests that the region around Eridu was indeed one of the earliest centres of settled life in southern Mesopotamia. The site was occupied continuously from around 5000 BCE to the early part of the second millennium BCE, a span of over 3,000 years. During its height, Eridu was a substantial city, though probably never as large as Uruk or Ur. Its importance was more religious than political. It was a holy city, a place of pilgrimage, a site imbued with primordial sanctity. Even after other cities had surpassed it in size and power, Eridu remained significant because of its status as the first city, the place where it all began. The temple hymns speak of Eridu's beauty. Eridu, your shadow extends over the midst of the sea, a princely city artfully built in a pure place. Your awe and splendour reach up to heaven. Your divine laws are splendid divine laws, unreachable. Picture this city in its glory. The ziggurat rising from the marshlands, its mud brick walls plastered and painted, gleaming in the harsh Mesopotamian sun. Priests in white linen garments performing ancient rituals, their voices chanting hymns that had been passed down for generations. The smell of incense and roasting meat from the sacrifices. The sound of lyres and drums accompanying the sacred songs. And Enki in his temple, in his underwater palace, the wise god who loved humanity, who taught them the arts and crafts they needed to survive and flourish. Enki, who preserved the secrets of creation, who knew the Meh, the divine principles that governed civilization itself. The Mess were sacred objects or concepts, the fundamental elements that made civilization possible. There were Mess for kingship, for priesthood, for music, for crafts, for warfare, for justice, over 100 different Mes in various listings. These were kept in Enki's temple in Eridu, and according to myth, any city that possessed the Mes would prosper and dominate. One famous story tells how Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travelled to Eridu and got Enki drunk on beer. In his intoxicated state he gave her the Emirs, which she quickly carried back to Uruk before he sobered up and realised what he had done. This myth may reflect historical memory of Uruk's rise to power and Eridu's relative decline, reframed as a divine comedy of trickery and theft. Even in its decline, Eridu remained important. As late as the 6th century BCE, during the Neo-Babylonian period, King Nebuchadnezzar II sponsored restoration work at the site, honouring the ancient shrine of Enki. By then, the city had been inhabited for more than 4,000 years, connecting the historical period to the deep prehistoric past. Today, the ruins of Eridu lie buried in the desert sands of southern Iraq. The ziggurat is an eroded mound, barely recognisable. The temples have crumbled to dust. The channels that once brought water from the rivers have long since dried up. But the memory remains, preserved in the texts that archaeologists have painstakingly translated, in the myths that still capture our imagination. Eridu reminds us that civilization has deep roots, stretching back far beyond the reach of written history into the mists of prehistory. The people who built the first shrines at Eridu around 5000 BCE were already sophisticated farmers and craftspeople, already organising themselves into communities, already worshipping gods whose names we will never know. The Anunnaki were their gods' names given later. But the impulse to honour divine powers, to build sacred spaces, to gather in worship and celebration, that impulse reaches back to the very dawn of human society. Chapter 9. The Epic of Gilgamesh. No discussion of the Anunnaki and Mesopotamian mythology would be complete without addressing one of the greatest works of ancient literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This epic poem, assembled from various Sumerian stories into its most complete form around 1800 BCE, tells the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. His mother was Ninsun, a goddess of wisdom. His father was Lugalbanda, a deified king. Gilgamesh thus stood at the boundary between divine and mortal realms, partaking of both natures, superior to ordinary humans but still subject to death. The epic begins with Gilgamesh oppressing his people through his excessive energy and demands. The people cry out to the gods for relief. In response, the goddess Aruru creates Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals, as a companion and equal to Gilgamesh, someone who can match his strength and channel his restless energy. After a fierce wrestling match that ends in mutual respect, Gilgamesh and Enkidu become devoted friends. Together they embark on adventures travelling to the cedar forest to slay Humbaba, the monstrous guardian appointed by Enlil. They kill the Bull of Heaven, which the goddess Ishtar sent to punish Gilgamesh for spurning her romantic advances. But these victories against divine servants come with consequences. The gods decree that one of the two heroes must die for their transgressions. Enkidu falls ill, and, after suffering for 12 days, dies. Gilgamesh is devastated by grief, and for the first time confronts his own mortality. If even Enkidu, who was mighty and strong, could die, then surely Gilgamesh himself would eventually die, despite his semi-divine nature. This realization drives the second half of the epic. Gilgamesh becomes obsessed with finding eternal life, with escaping the fate of mortality. He undertakes a long journey to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who was granted immortality by the gods. Perhaps Utnapishtim can reveal the secret of eternal life. The journey is arduous. Gilgamesh crosses mountains guarded by scorpion people. He travels through 12 leagues of absolute darkness. He passes through the garden of the gods, where trees bear jewels as fruit. Finally, he reaches the waters of death, which he must cross to reach Utnapishtim's dwelling. When Gilgamesh finally meets Utnapishtim, he begs for the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, how he was warned by Ea, how he built a boat, how the waters destroyed everything else but he and his family survived. When the flood subsided, Utnapishtim made offerings to the gods, and Enlil, impressed by his survival, granted him and his wife immortality and placed them in a paradise at the edge of the world. But this immortality was a unique gift, Utnapishtim explains, granted under extraordinary circumstances that will never occur again. There is no path to eternal life for Gilgamesh. However, Utnapishtim's wife persuades her husband to give Gilgamesh something. He tells the king of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant of rejuvenation that can restore youth. It is not immortality, but it is something. Gilgamesh dives deep, finds the plant, and begins his journey home, carrying this precious prize. But during the return journey, while bathing in a pool, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance and steals it, shedding its skin and gaining the power of renewal for all serpents forevermore. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having failed in his quest for immortality. But the journey has transformed him. He looks at the walls of his city with new eyes, seeing them not as a mark of his personal glory, but as his true immortality, his legacy, the contribution he has made to civilization that will outlast his mortal life. The epic ends with Gilgamesh accepting his mortality, understanding that while he cannot live forever, his deeds and his works will be remembered. The walls of Uruk, the temples he built, the civilization he fostered, these will endure long after his body returns to dust. This story resonates across millennia because it speaks to universal human concerns. The fear of death, the grief of losing loved ones, the search for meaning in a finite existence, the question of what, if anything, survives us after we die. But for our purposes, the Epic of Gilgamesh is significant, because it reveals how the Mesopotamians understood the relationship between gods and mortals. Even Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 divine, could not escape death. The boundary between mortal and immortal was absolute. The Anunnaki might walk among humans, might even mate with them and produce semi-divine offspring, but mortality was the defining characteristic of the human condition. The gods in this epic are not all powerful or all-knowing. They make mistakes, they change their minds, they feel regret. When Enlil sends the flood, the other gods weep, horrified by the destruction. Ishtar laments, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering battle for the destruction of my people, when it is I myself who give birth to my people, only to fill the sea like fish?" This is a pantheon of gods who are powerful but not omnipotent, wise but not omniscient, immortal but not unchanging. They feel emotions, love, anger, grief, jealousy. They form relationships, make alliances, hold grudges. They are in many ways like an immortal aristocratic family, with all the drama and dysfunction that implies. The Anunnaki in the Epic of Gilgamesh serve various roles. They are the ones who created humanity. They are the ones who sent the flood. They are the ones who judge the hero's actions and decree Enkidu's death. They are the ultimate powers that shape the world, yet they are also approachable, capable of being persuaded or tricked, moved by offerings and prayers. This accessibility of the divine is characteristic of Mesopotamian religion. Unlike some later theological traditions where God becomes increasingly transcendent and removed from the world, the Anunnaki remained immanent, present, involved in the daily affairs of mortals. Every city had its patron deity, who literally dwelt in the temple at the city's heart. Kings consulted the gods through divination before making important decisions. Priests performed daily rituals to feed and care for the divine statues. The world of the Epic of Gilgamesh is a world where the divine and human realms constantly intersect, where gods and mortals interact as a matter of course, where the boundary between heaven and earth is permeable even if it cannot ultimately be crossed. Chapter 10. Inanna's Descent to the Underworld. Another powerful myth that reveals the nature of the Anunnaki concerns Inanna, goddess of love and war, and her journey to the underworld. This story exists in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions. In Akkadian, Inanna becomes Ishtar, but the basic narrative remains consistent. Inanna decides to visit the underworld, the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The reasons for this journey vary in different versions. Perhaps she seeks to expand her power into this final realm. Perhaps she wishes to attend the funeral rites of her brother-in-law. Perhaps she's driven by curiosity or ambition. Whatever her motivation, Inanna prepares carefully. She dresses in all her divine regalia, her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, her royal robe, her breastplate, her ring, her measuring rod and line. She's adorned in the full symbols of her power and authority. She instructs her servant Ninchubur to appeal to the other gods for help, if she does not return within 3 days. Then Inanna descends to the underworld, approaching the first of 7 gates. At each gate, the Guardian demands that she remove one piece of her divine regalia. This is the law of the underworld. No one may enter fully clothed, fully powerful. All must be stripped bare before the realm of death. Inanna protests at each gate, but she has no choice. One by one, her symbols of power are taken from her. Her crown, her necklace, her robe, her breastplate, her ring, her rod and line. Finally, she stands naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal and the 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki who rule this realm of the dead. These underworld Anunnaki are different from the gods of heaven and earth. They are associated with death, judgment, and fate. They sit in solemn assembly, their eyes fixed on Inanna as she enters their domain, and they judge her harshly. Ereshkigal, consumed with rage, whether at her sister's presumption in entering her realm or for some other grievance we can only guess, kills Inanna and hangs her corpse on a hook on the wall. The goddess of love and life is now a piece of rotting meat, displayed like a trophy in the realm of death. Time passes differently in the underworld. 3 days pass in the world above. Ninshuba, faithful servant, fulfills her duty and appeals to the gods for help. She goes first to Enlil, who refuses, saying that Inanna brought this on herself by descending to the underworld. She goes to Nanna, the moon god, who also refuses. Finally, she appeals to Enki, the wise god, the friend of humanity, and he agrees to help. From the dirt beneath his fingernails, Enki creates 2 creatures, neither male nor female, neither living nor dead. He gives them the food and water of life, and he sends them to the underworld with instructions. These creatures can enter the underworld because they are liminal beings, existing in the space between categories. They find Ereshkigal in agony. Some versions say she's in the pangs of childbirth, others that she is mourning. The creatures sympathize with her suffering, and touched by their empathy, she offers them a gift. They ask for the corpse of Inanna, and reluctantly Ereshkigal agrees. The creatures sprinkle the food and water of life on Inanna's corpse, and she is revived. But there is a law in the underworld. No one who has entered may leave unless they provide a substitute, someone to take their place. Inanna begins her ascent, accompanied by demons who will drag her back to the underworld if she cannot find a replacement. She passes various gods and devotees who are mourning her death, wearing sackcloth and ashes. She spares each of these, grateful for their loyalty and grief. Finally, she returns to Uruk and finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on a throne dressed in royal garments, not mourning at all, but apparently enjoying his power in her absence. Enraged by his lack of grief, she points at him, and the demons seize him to drag him to the underworld in her place. Dumuzi flees, praying to Utu the sun god to transform him and help him escape. Various chase scenes ensue. Eventually, Dumuzi's sister Geshti Nana offers to take his place for half of each year, so that neither must spend eternity in the underworld. And so it was decreed. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld and half in the world above. This myth became the basis for annual religious festivals in Mesopotamia. The death and resurrection of Dumuzi were ritually enacted each year, marking the cycle of seasons, the death of vegetation in summer's heat, and its rebirth with the winter rains. The lamentations for Dumuzi were famous throughout the ancient Near East, mentioned even in the Hebrew Bible. But beyond its agricultural symbolism, this myth reveals important truths about the Mesopotamian understanding of death and the divine. Even the gods are subject to certain inviolable laws. Inanna, powerful goddess though she is, cannot simply walk out of the underworld once she has entered. Someone must take her place. The realm of death demands its due. The Anunnaki of the underworld are stern judges who maintain cosmic order. They cannot be bribed or persuaded by divine authority. They enforce the fundamental law: what dies must remain dead, unless a substitute is found. This is a darker view of the cosmos than many modern religions offer. There is no promise of resurrection, no hope of an afterlife in paradise. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief was a dreary place, a land of dust where the dead existed as shadows of their former selves, drinking muddy water and eating clay, remembering their lives but unable to return to them. The best one could hope for was proper burial, regular offerings from descendants, and remembrance. The worst fate was to be forgotten, to have no one pour libations for you, to be completely cut off from the world of the living. Yet even this grim vision has a certain dignity. The Mesopotamians faced mortality without illusions, without comforting promises of eternal paradise. They built their civilization knowing it was temporary, that they were temporary, that all would eventually return to dust. And still they built, still they created, still they sought to leave something of value, something that would outlast their brief span of years. Chapter 11. The Tablets of Destiny. Among the many divine objects in Mesopotamian mythology, few are as important as the Tablet of Destinies, also called the Tablets of Fate. These tablets held the power to determine the fate of everything in the universe. Whoever possessed the Tablet of Destinies effectively controlled the cosmos. Originally, the tablets belonged to Enlil, king of the gods, kept secure in his temple. They represented his authority to decree fate, to determine the destiny of gods and mortals alike. But according to myth, the tablets were stolen by Anzu, a monstrous bird with the head of a lion and the body of an eagle, so massive its wingspan could darken the sky. Anzu was originally a servant of Enlil, perhaps a guardian of sorts, but ambition grew in Anzu's heart. The monster watched Enlil bathe in sacred waters, saw the tablets left temporarily unguarded, and seized the opportunity. Snatching the Tablet of Destinies, Anzu fled to a mountain far from the divine city. With the tablets in his possession, Anzu believed himself invincible. Any attack launched against him would be turned back by the power of the tablets. Any decree made against him would be nullified. He had effectively made himself immune to divine authority. The gods were thrown into panic. Without the Tablet of Destinies, the cosmic order was threatened. Storms refused to blow, rains refused to fall. The natural order began to break down. Someone had to retrieve the tablets, but who could stand against Anzu when he wielded such power? He called for a champion. One by one, various gods were asked to take on this task, and one by one they refused, each understanding the danger involved. Finally, depending on which version of the myth one reads, either Ninurta or Marduk agreed to face the monster. The battle was fierce. The hero god launched arrows at Anzu, but the monster used the power of the tablets to turn them back, decreeing that they should disassemble in mid-flight, their feathers scattering, their shafts breaking. The hero's weapons were useless against the power of destiny itself, but the hero was cunning. He called upon Ea's wisdom and devised a strategy. He would shoot not one arrow but a volley, creating a storm of projectiles. One of these would have to pierce Anzu's wing before the monster could decree against it. Once Anzu was wounded and distracted, the hero could close in for the kill. The strategy succeeded. Anzu's wing was pierced. The monster tumbled from the sky. The hero seized the Tablet of Destinies and returned it to Enlil, restoring order to the cosmos. For this deed, the hero was greatly honoured and elevated in the divine hierarchy. This myth speaks to the Mesopotamian understanding of cosmic order as something that must be actively maintained. The universe was not self-sustaining, not guaranteed to continue functioning smoothly. It required the constant vigilance and effort of the gods, particularly Enlil, who held ultimate authority through his possession of the Tablet of Destinies. The tablets represent what we might call the natural laws of the universe, the principles that govern how things work, the cosmic constitution that determines what is and is not possible. In Mesopotamian thought, These laws were not abstract principles, but were actually written down, recorded on divine tablets that could theoretically be read and manipulated by anyone who possessed them. This is a very different view of natural law than modern science offers. For us, the laws of physics are descriptions of how the universe happens to work. They cannot be changed or stolen because they are not objects but relationships. But for the ancient Mesopotamians, the structure of reality was more contingent, more dependent on divine will and divine artifacts. If someone seized the tablet of destinies, they could reshape reality itself, decreeing new fates, new destinies, new natural laws. This was the ultimate power, the power that made Enlil king of the gods, not merely his strength or wisdom, but his control over the very fabric of existence. Yet even this power had limits. The myths make clear that fate, once decreed, could not easily be changed. When the Anunnaki assembled and made a joint decision, when fate was formally determined and recorded, even the gods themselves were bound by it. This is why, in the flood story, Enlil cannot simply decree that humanity will be destroyed. He must get the agreement of the divine assembly. And once Utnapishtim has survived and been granted immortality, even Enlil cannot revoke that gift. The concept of fate was serious business in Mesopotamian thought. Kings regularly consulted oracles and performed divination to try to discern what fate had in store. If the omens were bad, elaborate rituals might be performed to avert disaster. But there was always an understanding that fate, once set, was difficult or impossible to alter. This might seem fatalistic from our modern perspective, but the Mesopotamians balanced divine determinism with human agency. Yes, the gods decreed certain outcomes, but humans still had to act, to make choices, to take responsibility for their lives. A king might know from omens that his city would be attacked, but he still had to decide how to prepare his defences, when to seek allies, whether to negotiate or fight. The Tablet of Destinies represented the ultimate authority over fate, but even that authority was constrained by cosmic law, by the assembled will of the Anunnaki, by the fundamental structure of reality that even the gods had to respect. Chapter 12. The Myth of Adapa. Another significant myth that explores the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity is the story of Adapa, a wise man who, through his encounter with the gods, came close to gaining immortality but ultimately remained mortal. Adapa was the son of Ea, created by the god to be a model of humanity. Wise, intelligent, a priest who performed the sacred rituals with perfect precision. Ea gave Adapa wisdom but deliberately withheld immortality. Adapa served in the temple at Eridu, Ea's sacred city, performing the daily rituals, making offerings, maintaining the connection between the divine and human worlds. One day, Adapa went fishing in the Persian Gulf to catch fish for the temple offerings. While he was on the water, the south wind rose up and capsized his boat, plunging him into the sea. Adapa, enraged by this assault, cursed the south wind and broke its wings, so that for 7 days no south wind blew across the land. Anu, the sky god, noticed the absence of the south wind and inquired about what had happened. When he learned that a mortal man had broken the wings of the wind, he was astonished. How could a mere human have such power? He summoned Adapa to heaven to answer for his deed. Ea, Adapa's divine father, was worried. He knew that Anu might punish Adapa harshly, perhaps even decree his death. So Ea gave Adapa careful instructions. He told him to dress in mourning clothes when he went to heaven. When asked why he was mourning, he should say he mourned for Dumuzi and Gazida, 2 gods who had departed from earth to dwell in heaven. This would please these gods, who would then speak on Adapa's behalf. Most importantly, Ea warned Adapa that when he was offered food and water in heaven, he should refuse to eat or drink. Ea, who knew the ways of the gods, understood that the food and water would be the food and water of death, intended to kill the presumptuous mortal who had dared to harm the south wind. Adapa followed these instructions precisely. He ascended to heaven dressed in mourning. When Dumuzi and Gazida saw him and heard his explanation, they were indeed pleased and spoke favourably of him to Anu. Anu, mollified by their words and by Adapa's respectful demeanour, decided not to punish the mortal. Instead, impressed by Adapa's wisdom and by the respect shown to the gods, Anu made an extraordinary decision. He would offer Adapa the food and water of life, granting him immortality, allowing him to remain forever in heaven as a servant of the gods. Servants brought forth the bread of life and the water of life. But Adapa, remembering Ea's warning, refused to eat or drink. Anu was puzzled. "Why do you not eat or drink?" he asked. Adapa explained that his father Ea had warned him against it. Then Anu laughed, perhaps ruefully. He understood what had happened. Ea, not knowing that Anu would be merciful, had given Adapa instructions based on the assumption that he would be offered death, not life. And now, through this misunderstanding, humanity had lost its chance at immortality. Anu sent Adapa back, to Earth, still mortal, still subject to death, and from that day forward, humanity was destined to die, to age and sicken and return to dust, because Adapa had refused the gift of eternal life based on a father's well-intentioned but ultimately mistaken warning. This myth operates on multiple levels. On one hand, it explains why humans are mortal, because of a tragic misunderstanding, a missed opportunity that can never be reclaimed. On another level, it reveals something about the relationship between Ea and humanity. Ea loved his human creations, tried to protect them, but his very protectiveness sometimes limited them. He gave Adapa wisdom, but not immortality. He tried to save Adapa's life, but in doing so prevented him from gaining eternal life. There is also a tension here between the different gods. Ea acts independently, giving advice to his human son without consulting with Anu. Anu, the supreme god, exercises his prerogative to be merciful, to grant immortality even though strictly speaking he was not obligated to do so. The lack of communication between the gods leads to the tragic outcome. But perhaps most significantly, this myth suggests that immortality was theoretically possible for humans. It was not absolutely forbidden by the structure of reality. A human could, under the right circumstances, be granted the food and water of life. Utnapishtim received it after surviving the flood. Adapa came close to receiving it, but refused. This must have been both tantalizing and frustrating for the ancient Mesopotamians. The belief that immortality was real, that the gods possessed it, that it could theoretically be shared with mortals, but that in practice it was forever out of reach, denied by fate or circumstance or divine decision. The myth of Adapa, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, ultimately affirms human mortality as the defining characteristic of our existence. We are the creatures who die. We are the beings given wisdom but not immortality, given the capacity to understand our own mortality but not the power to transcend it. And yet, as with Gilgamesh, there is a kind of dignity in this acceptance. We make meaning within our brief span of years. We create, we love, we build, we preserve knowledge for future generations. Our mortality is what gives urgency and poignancy to our lives. If we lived forever, would anything matter? Would there be any reason to act today rather than tomorrow, to build now rather than later? Perhaps Ea's withholding of immortality and Adapa's rejection of it were actually gifts in disguise, the gift of a meaningful life, bounded by birth and death, precious precisely because it is temporary. Chapter 13, The Seven Sages and the Me. According to Mesopotamian tradition, civilization was not developed gradually by human ingenuity alone, but was taught to humanity by 7 sages sent by the gods. These sages, called the Apkallu in Akkadian, were wise beings who appeared in the antediluvian period, before the Great Flood, to instruct the first humans in the arts of civilization. The Apkallu were not quite gods and not quite human. They were described sometimes as fishmen, beings who emerge from the sea each day to teach humanity, then return to the ocean depths each night. They were associated with Ea Enki, the god of wisdom and the waters, and were sent by him to fulfill his role as humanity's patron and teacher. Each of the 7 sages was associated with one of the antediluvian kings mentioned in the king lists. Together they taught humans how to build cities, how to establish kingship, how to perform religious rituals, how to practice law and justice, how to cultivate fields and irrigate crops, how to raise domesticated animals, how to work metal and craft tools, how to heal diseases, how to write and keep records. In essence, everything that distinguished civilized life from the existence of nomadic hunter-gatherers was attributed to the teaching of these 7 sages. Civilization was not a human achievement but a divine gift, mediated through these wise beings who bridged the gap between divine knowledge and human capacity. This teaching was sometimes described in terms of the me, those fundamental principles or powers that made civilization possible. The me were divine ordinances, the essential components of civilized life, and they were originally held by Enki in his temple at Eridu. There were more than 100 different me in various listings. Some were concrete: kingship, priesthood, the crown, the throne, the royal sceptre. Others were more abstract: truth, justice, wisdom, craft, music, art. Still others were institutions or practices: temple building, sacrifice, warfare, judgment, sexual intercourse, prostitution. Each me was necessary for a functioning civilization. Together, they constituted the complete blueprint for human society, and all of them ultimately belonged to the gods, particularly to Enki, who was their keeper, and who could bestow them or withhold them according to his will. The story of how Inanna acquired the me for Uruk is particularly illuminating. She travelled to Eridu and was welcomed by Enki with a feast. As the beer flowed freely, Enki became increasingly generous and intoxicated. One by one, he offered Inanna the me, and she accepted them gladly, loading them onto her boat. When Enki sobered up and realised what he had done, he sent servants to retrieve the me, but Inanna had already reached Uruk. She unloaded the divine ordinances in her city, and from that moment Uruk flourished and became one of the greatest cities of ancient Mesopotamia. This story is often read as a myth explaining Uruk's historical rise to prominence, but it also reveals something about how the Mesopotamians understood the source of civilization. Cities prospered not merely because of good location, or abundant resources or skilled leaders, though all those helped, but primarily because they possessed the me, the divine, ordinances that made civilized life possible. Without the me, a settlement would remain just a village. With them, it could become a great city, a centre of culture and power. The me were the software, so to speak, that allowed the hardware of urban infrastructure to function properly. And these me came from the gods, from the Anunnaki, who had established the principles of civilization before humanity even existed. Humans were taught these principles, trained to implement them, given the tools to build civilized society. But the ultimate source was always divine. This understanding had practical implications. It meant that maintaining proper relations with the gods was essential for a city's survival and prosperity. If the gods withdrew their favour, if the me were taken away, civilization itself would collapse. Cities would fall, literacy would be lost, social order would dissolve. Conversely, new cities could be founded and blessed by the gods with the me needed to thrive. Kings claimed that they built their cities and established their laws according to divine instructions, implementing the me as they had been taught by the gods through dreams, visions, or priestly oracles. The 7 sages represented the initial gift of this knowledge to humanity in the distant past, but the relationship continued throughout history, with the gods providing ongoing guidance through various means, ensuring that humans did not forget the principles of civilized life. After the flood, according to tradition, the 7 antediluvian sages were no longer active, but their teaching had been preserved, passed down through generations, written on clay tablets, embodied in the institutions and practices of Mesopotamian society. Later, new sages appeared, human sages this time, wise men like Adapa who served the gods and interpreted divine will. These post-flood sages never achieved the status of the original 7 Apkallu, but they continued the tradition, preserving ancient wisdom and transmitting it to new generations. The continuity from the antediluvian past to the historical present was maintained through careful preservation of texts, through the training of scribes in the scribal schools, through the performance of rituals that had been handed down unchanged for thousands of years. Chapter 14. The Underworld and its Rulers. We have already discussed Inanna's descent to the underworld, but let us now explore this realm more fully, for the Mesopotamian underworld was ruled by its own contingent of Anunnaki, gods of death and judgment who held power over the realm of the dead. The underworld was known by various names: Irkala, Kur, Arali. It was imagined as existing beneath the earth, a dark realm separated from the world of the living by 7 walls and 7 gates. To reach it, the dead had to cross a river, sometimes called the Hubur, with the help of a ferryman who transported souls to their final destination. This underworld was not a place of punishment or reward based on moral behaviour. It was simply the place where all dead went, regardless of how they had lived. A few exceptional individuals might be granted special status. Kings and priests might dwell in slightly better conditions, warriors who died gloriously in battle might be honoured, but for the most part the afterlife was a grim, egalitarian realm where former kings and former slaves all drank muddy water and ate dust together. The ruler of this realm was Ereshkigal, whose name means Lady of the Great Earth, or Lady of the Great Below. She was one of the original Anunnaki, assigned to the underworld in the primordial division of cosmic realms. Some myths describe her as having been dragged down to the underworld against her will, forced to become its queen rather than choosing this role freely. Ereshkigal was not entirely alone in her dark kingdom. She had a husband, Nergal, god of plague and war, who through a complex series of events ended up sharing her throne. The story of how Nergal became Ereshkigal's consort is itself quite interesting. According to myth, the gods held a banquet in heaven, and all the Anunnaki were invited. But Ereshkigal, bound to the underworld and unable to leave her realm, sent a messenger to receive her portion of the feast. All the gods stood up respectfully when this messenger arrived, all except Nergal, who remained seated, showing disrespect to the queen of the underworld. Ereshkigal was furious at this insult. She demanded that Nergal be sent to the underworld to be punished. Nergal, guided by Ea, descended to the underworld with a specific plan. He would seduce Ereshkigal, and when she was distracted by passion, he would seize her throne and threaten her life, forcing her to grant him co-rulership of the underworld. The plan succeeded, though not quite as intended. Nergal and Ereshkigal did become lovers, but rather than resolving in violence, they came to a mutual understanding. Nergal agreed to stay in the underworld as Ereshkigal's consort and co-ruler, sharing the dark throne with her, perhaps finding in her someone who matched his own fierce nature. Together, they ruled the realm of death, attended by various demon and spirits. The Anunnaki of the underworld served as judges, determining the fate of each soul that entered their realm. 7 judges sat in solemn assembly. Their word was final, their gaze terrible to behold. These underworld Anunnaki were different from their celestial counterparts. They were associated with death, darkness, and the inexorable fate that awaited all living things. They were not malevolent exactly, but they were implacable. They simply did their job, which was to rule the dead and maintain order in the realm below. Various demons and spirits also inhabited the underworld, or moved between the underworld and the earth. The Gala were demons who dragged the dead down to the underworld, who served as Ereshkigal's enforcers. These were the demons who accompanied Inanna when she tried to leave the underworld, ready to drag her back if she could not find a substitute. The Mesopotamians believed that the dead, if not properly buried or cared for, could return as ghosts to trouble the living. The spirit of someone who died violently, who was not given proper funeral rites, who had no descendants to make offerings. Such a ghost might wander the earth, causing illness and misfortune. Elaborate rituals existed to appease these restless spirits, to send them back to the underworld where they belonged. Offerings to the dead were an important part of Mesopotamian religious practice. Living descendants would pour water libations, leave food offerings, and speak the names of their ancestors, ensuring that the dead were not forgotten, that they received sustenance in the afterlife. Without such care, the dead might suffer terribly in the underworld, drinking only stagnant water, eating only dust. Despite its grim nature, the underworld served an essential cosmic function. It was the final destination for all that died, the realm where decay and dissolution happened, the place from which new life could eventually emerge. In some myths, the underworld is associated with fertility, Dumuzi's descent and return marking the cycle of vegetation, death in summer and rebirth in winter. The underworld Anunnaki, though fearsome, were not enemies of life. They were simply the administrators of death, carrying out their assigned function in the cosmic order. Life and death were both necessary, both part of the same great cycle, both overseen by different contingents of the Anunnaki. Chapter 15. Astronomy and the Anunnaki. The ancient Mesopotamians were keen observers of the heavens. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, planets and stars with remarkable precision, developing one of the first systematic astronomical traditions in human history. This was not merely scientific curiosity, though there was certainly an element of that. Astronomy was intimately connected with religion, astrology, and the divine. The heavens were the realm of the gods, and the movements of celestial bodies were understood as manifestations of divine will, omens that could be read and interpreted by those with the proper training. The 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn were each associated with specific gods. The sun was Shamash, or Utu in Sumerian, the all-seeing god of justice who brought light to the world, before whom no secret could be hidden. The moon was Sin, or Nana, the wise elder god who measured time by his waxing and waning. Venus, the brightest planet, was associated with Inanna, Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Venus's dual nature, appearing sometimes as the morning star, sometimes as the evening star, matched Inanna's dual nature as goddess of both love and warfare, creation and destruction. Jupiter was associated with Marduk in Babylonian tradition, the king of the gods who had defeated Tiamat and created the world. Mars was Nergal, god of plague and war, whose red colour suggested blood and violence. Mercury was Nabu, god of writing and wisdom, son of Marduk. Saturn was Ninurta, god of hunting and war, or sometimes associated with other deities depending on the period and tradition. The movements of these planets were carefully tracked and recorded. Over centuries of observation, Mesopotamian astronomers developed the ability to predict eclipses, to calculate the length of the year with remarkable accuracy, to create calendars that synchronized lunar and solar cycles. But these observations were not merely recorded as data. They were interpreted as messages from the gods. An eclipse might portend disaster for a king. The appearance of a comet might signal war. The conjunction of certain planets in a particular constellation might indicate a favourable time for military campaigns or construction projects. Vast compendia of omens were compiled, recording thousands of astronomical observations along with the events that had coincided with them. Future observations could then be compared against these records to predict what might happen. This was the basis of Mesopotamian astrology, which was closely intertwined with astronomy. The zodiac as we know it today has its roots in Mesopotamian tradition. The 12 signs, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on, correspond to 12 constellations that the sun passes through over the course of a year. The Mesopotamians identified these constellations and created elaborate mythologies around them. The stars themselves were organised into constellations representing gods, heroes, animals, and objects from mythology. The night sky was a celestial text that could be read by those with proper training, revealing divine intentions and cosmic patterns. But beyond the practical uses of astronomy and astrology, there was a deeper theological significance. The regularity of celestial movements, their predictability, was understood as evidence of cosmic order, of the divine governance of the universe. The fact that eclipses could be predicted demonstrated that the cosmos was not chaotic, but operated according to fixed laws, the laws established by the Anunnaki when they created the world. Anu, the sky god, dwelt in the highest heaven, and his realm was associated with the fixed stars, those celestial bodies that never changed their relative positions, that wheeled around the pole star in eternal unchanging motion. This was the realm of absolute permanence, of eternal divine law. Below Anu's heaven was the realm of Enlil, associated with the planets and the changes they underwent. This was the realm of governance, of active divine intervention in the world, of the execution of divine decrees. Below that was the realm of Ea, associated with the subterranean waters, with wisdom and magic, with the hidden forces that sustained visible creation. Thus the cosmos was divided vertically as well as horizontally, with different realms assigned to different gods, each level having its proper function in the cosmic order. The cosmos, in Mesopotamian understanding, was a unified whole, with each part corresponding to divine authority and purpose. As you drift deeper into relaxation, imagine this ordered universe, everything in its place, everything following the ancient patterns set down at creation. Chapter 16. The Divine Craftsman and the Arts of Civilization. Among the Anunnaki were gods who specialized in particular crafts and skills, deities who presided over the technologies that made civilized life possible. These divine craftsmen were patrons of human artisans, teachers of techniques, guardians of professional secrets. Ninurta, besides being a warrior god, was also associated with agriculture and irrigation. He was credited with organizing the world after the flood, placing stones and minerals in their proper locations, teaching humans how to dig canals and control water flow. In some hymns, he is praised for creating the plough, that essential tool that transformed human relationship with the earth. Nidaba was the goddess of writing, grain, and accounting. In the Scribal schools, students would begin their education by invoking her name, asking for her blessing as they learned the complex cuneiform script. Writing was not considered a purely human invention, but a divine gift, a sacred art that required years of training to master. The scribes who learned this art were among the most respected members of Mesopotamian society. They could read and write, skills that the vast majority of people lacked. They kept the records that made complex administration possible. They copied the ancient texts that preserved knowledge across generations. They composed new works of literature, adding to the cultural heritage of their civilization. Imagine a scribal school in ancient Sumer. Young boys, for scribes were almost always male, sitting in rows on the floor, clay tablets on their laps, practicing the same signs over and over, the teacher walking among them, correcting their work, sometimes with harsh discipline, the smell of wet clay, the quiet scratching of styluses pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft tablets. These students would spend years memorizing hundreds of different signs, learning the multiple meanings each sign could have, mastering the art of combining signs to express complex ideas. They would copy out the ancient texts, myths, hymns, proverbs, mathematical problems, legal formulas, absorbing the accumulated wisdom of their civilization. The goddess Nisaba watched over their efforts, guiding their hands, helping them master this divine art. To become a scribe was to join a sacred profession, to become a keeper of knowledge, a bridge between past and future. Other gods presided over other crafts. Kotha Wakasis, though more prominent in Ugaritic than Mesopotamian, texts represented divine craftsmanship, the ability to create objects of beauty and power. Every craftsman, the metalworker at his forge, the potter at his wheel, the weaver at her loom, the carpenter shaping wood, worked under the patronage of divine beings who had first practiced these crafts in heaven before teaching them to mortals. The tools themselves were sometimes considered semi-divine. A particularly well-made plough might be given a name, treated with respect, cared for with ritual attention. The forge where metal was shaped by fire was a liminal space where transformation occurred, where raw ore became useful tools and weapons through the application of techniques taught by the gods. In this worldview there was no clear boundary between the sacred and the profane, between religious activity and daily work. Everything was interconnected. A farmer ploughing his field was participating in divine order, continuing the work that Ninurta had begun. A scribe copying a tablet was preserving divine wisdom, keeping alive the knowledge that Nisaba had taught. A priestess weaving cloth for temple statues was creating beauty that would please the gods. This integration of the divine into every aspect of life gave meaning and dignity to even the most mundane tasks. You were not merely working for survival or profit, you were fulfilling your role in the cosmic order, contributing to the maintenance of civilization, honouring the gods who had made your craft possible. Chapter 17. Sacred Marriage and the Fertility Cult. One of the most important rituals in ancient Mesopotamia was the sacred marriage, a ceremony in which the king would ritually unite with a high priestess representing Inanna, Ishtar, goddess of love and fertility. This ritual was believed to ensure the prosperity of the land, the fertility of fields and flocks, the continuation of the community. The sacred marriage was not merely symbolic, it was understood as an actual sacred act, a moment when the boundary between human and divine became permeable, when the king became temporarily identified with the god Dumuzi, and the priestess embodied the goddess Inanna. This ritual took place annually, often during the New Year festival, when the old year died and the new year was born. It was a time of renewal, of cleansing, of reaffirming the covenant between gods and mortals, between rulers and ruled. Picture the ceremony, the city decorated for festival, people in the streets celebrating, music and dancing, the smell of incense and roasting meat from countless sacrifices, and at the centre of it all, in the temple of Inanna, the sacred chamber where the ritual would be performed. The king would undergo ritual purification, bathing in sacred water, anointing himself with holy oil, dressing in ceremonial garments. The priestess would similarly prepare herself, adorning herself with the symbols of the goddess, becoming for this night more than human, becoming the divine itself, made manifest. The ritual poems that describe this ceremony are both beautiful and explicit, celebrating the joy of physical union, the pleasure of the goddess and her consort. There is no shame in this tradition. no sense that physical love is somehow base or corrupted. Rather, sexuality is understood as a sacred force, a divine gift, essential to the continuation of life. After the sacred marriage, the king would emerge renewed, his authority reaffirmed, his connection to the divine strengthened. The people would celebrate, confident that the goddess had blessed their land, that the coming year would bring abundant harvests, healthy children, prosperity, and peace. This ritual reflects a deep understanding of the interconnection between cosmic order and earthly fertility, between divine favour and human flourishing. The gods were not distant abstractions, but intimate presences whose blessings were sought through embodied ritual, through physical acts that mirrored divine relationships. Inanna herself was a complex deity, embodying apparent contradictions. She was goddess of love, but also of war. She brought life, but could also bring death. She was associated with the planet Venus, which appears sometimes in the evening, sometimes in the morning, a celestial body that seems to die and be reborn. Her myths reflect this complexity. We have already discussed her descent to the underworld, her death and resurrection. But there are many other stories. Her courtship of Dumuzi, her rejection of Gilgamesh's advances and her revenge on him, her acquisition of the divine me from Enki, her role in countless wars and conflicts. She was not a comfortable goddess, not easily appeased or understood. She demanded devotion but could be capricious. She blessed her favourites but could turn against them without warning. Yet she was immensely popular, worshipped throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, her cult spreading as far as Egypt and Anatolia. Perhaps people recognised in Inanna's contradictions something of the essential mystery of existence, the way life and death are intertwined, the way love and violence can coexist, the way nothing in life is simple or one-dimensional. Inanna represented life in all its complexity, all its danger, all its terrible beauty. Chapter 18. Law, Justice, and Divine Order. The Anunnaki were not only creators and sustainers of the cosmos, but also the ultimate source of law and justice. Every legal code, every court judgment, every punishment or reward was ultimately based on principles established by the gods. The most famous legal code from ancient Mesopotamia is the Code of Hammurabi, though it was not the first. Earlier law codes existed going back to the Sumerian period. But Hammurabi's code, carved on a massive stone stela around 1750 BCE, is the most complete and best preserved. At the top of this stela is a carved relief showing Hammurabi standing before the sun god Shamash, who is seated on a throne, extending toward the king the symbols of authority, a rod and ring, representing justice and the power to measure and regulate. The scene makes clear that Hammurabi is not inventing these laws from his own wisdom, but receiving them from the god, acting as a divine intermediary. The prologue to the code states this explicitly. When Anu the Sublime, king of the Anunnaki, and Bel, lord of heaven and earth, who decreed the fate of the land, assigned to Marduk, the overruling son of Ea, god of righteousness, dominion over earthly man, and made him great among the Agigi, they called Babylon by his illustrious name, made it great on earth, and founded an everlasting kingdom in it, whose foundations are laid so solidly as those of heaven and earth. Then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land. In other words, Hammurabi's authority to make and enforce laws came directly from the Anunnaki. He was their chosen instrument for establishing justice, for creating social order according to divine principles. The laws themselves covered everything from property rights to marriage and divorce, from commercial transactions to criminal penalties, from inheritance to agricultural regulations. They represent a sophisticated legal system, nuanced and complex, attempting to address the many situations that could arise in a complex urban society. Many of the laws follow the principle of proportional justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, though the specific penalties varied based on social class. A person who injured a member of the aristocracy would face a harsher penalty than someone who injured a slave. This might seem unjust to modern sensibilities, but it reflected the hierarchical nature of Mesopotamian society, and the belief that different social classes had different inherent worth. Justice was administered through courts where cases were heard, evidence was presented, witnesses testified, oaths were sworn by the gods. To swear falsely by Shamash or Marduk was not merely perjury but sacrilege, calling down divine wrath on the false swearer. Shamash, the sun god, was particularly associated with justice. As the sun, he saw everything that happened under heaven. No crime could be hidden from his all-seeing eye, no injustice could escape his notice. Kings would invoke Shamash when rendering judgments, asking for his wisdom and guidance. In the divine assembly of the Anunnaki, justice was administered in the same way. Cases were presented, evidence was reviewed, judgments were rendered. Even the gods were subject to divine law, to the principles that governed cosmic order. This belief in divine justice provided comfort to those who suffered injustice in the mortal world. Even if human courts failed, even if the powerful oppressed the weak with impunity, the gods saw everything and would ultimately ensure that justice was done. The wicked might prosper, temporarily, but eventually they would face divine judgment. At the same time, this belief created a burden of anxiety. If every misfortune could be interpreted as divine punishment for sin, then suffering became a sign of guilt. When disaster struck, illness, crop failure, military defeat, the natural response was to search for what offence had been committed, what god had been angered, what ritual had been neglected. Complex systems of divination existed to discern divine will, to understand why the gods were angry and what could be done to appease them. Priests would examine the entrails of sacrificed animals looking for omens. They would observe unusual natural phenomena, thunder out of season, strange behaviour of animals, deformities in newborn livestock. They would interpret dreams, study the patterns of smoke rising from incense, watch the movements of oil dropped on water. All of these were ways of reading the divine will, of understanding what the Anunnaki wanted, of maintaining proper relationship with the cosmic order. Law and justice were not separate from religion, but were at the heart of religious practice, for to live justly was to honour the gods, and to honour the gods required living according to their laws. Chapter 19. The Decline of the Gods. The worship of the Anunnaki did not end suddenly, but gradually faded over centuries as new religions emerged and old traditions were forgotten. The process began even within Mesopotamian civilization, as different empires rose and fell, as different cities dominated at different times, as theological innovations introduced new ways of understanding the divine. The elevation of Marduk to supreme god under the Babylonian Empire represented a significant shift. While Anu, Enlil and Enki remained important, Marduk absorbed many of their functions and attributes, becoming the focus of religious devotion in a way that eclipsed the older pantheon. The Enuma Elish, which we discussed earlier, was essentially propaganda for this theological revolution. By making Marduk the hero who defeated Tiamat and created the world, by having the other gods freely acknowledge his supremacy and grant him their powers, the priests of Babylon provided a mythological justification for Marduk's preeminence. Later, under the Persian Empire, new religious ideas entered Mesopotamia. Zoroastrianism, with its emphasis on a cosmic struggle between good and evil, between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, offered a different way of understanding the divine. Instead of a pantheon of gods with different personalities and domains, there was a dualistic vision of light versus darkness, truth versus lies. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Greek culture and religion flooded into Mesopotamia. The Greek gods were identified with Mesopotamian deities, Zeus with Marduk or Bel, Aphrodite with Ishtar, but these identifications gradually transformed the understanding of the old gods, Hellenizing them, making them more like Greek deities and less like their original Mesopotamian forms. By the time of the Roman Empire, the old Mesopotamian religious traditions were maintained primarily in small communities, by priests who copied the ancient tablets and performed rituals that most people no longer understood. The great temples fell into disrepair, the ziggurats crumbled, the cities that had been centres of worship for millennia were abandoned or repurposed. The rise of Christianity and later Islam in the region completed the transformation. Monotheistic religions that rejected the existence of all gods except one could not accommodate the Anunnaki. At best, the old gods were reinterpreted as demons or fallen angels. At worst, they were dismissed as mere superstitions, figments of pagan imagination. The last cuneiform tablet was written sometime in the 1st century CE. After that, the ability to read the ancient script was lost. the myths and hymns and prayers carved on thousands of clay tablets became indecipherable, preserved only as curious artifacts, patterns pressed into clay whose meaning was utterly forgotten. For more than 1,000 years, the Anunnaki slept in the earth, buried under the ruins of their temples waiting to be rediscovered. The great cities of Mesopotamia were reduced to tells, mounds of earth covering layer upon layer of human habitation. Travellers passed by these mounds without realising that beneath them lay some of the greatest treasures of human civilization. It was not until the 19th century that archaeologists began systematic excavation of Mesopotamian sites. They uncovered the ruins of Babylon, Nineveh, Uruk. They found thousands of clay tablets and painstakingly deciphered the cuneiform script. Slowly, the ancient voices began to speak again, telling stories that had been silent for 2 millennia. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization was a revelation. Here was proof of sophisticated urban societies existing thousands of years before Greece and Rome, before the biblical patriarchs, at the very dawn of recorded history. Here were literary masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh, legal codes like Hammurabi's laws, scientific texts documenting astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. And here were the gods, the Anunnaki, preserved in countless texts, their myths and rituals described in detail, their temples mapped and excavated, their statues recovered from the earth where they had been buried for so long. Chapter 20. Modern Interpretations and Ancient Astronaut Theory. In the 20th century, a new interpretation of the Anunnaki emerged, one that would capture popular imagination even as it was rejected by mainstream scholarship. This was the ancient astronaut theory, which proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological gods, but actual extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth in ancient times. The most famous proponent of this theory was Zecharia Sitchin, who published a series of books beginning in the 1970s arguing that Sumerian texts, when properly translated, revealed that the Anunnaki were aliens from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth to mine gold and genetically engineered humans to serve as workers. Sitchin's interpretations were based on controversial readings of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, and his work has been extensively criticised by scholars who point out numerous errors in his translations and his selective use of evidence. Professional Assyriologists, scholars who specialise in ancient Mesopotamian languages and cultures, have largely dismissed his theories as pseudo-archaeology. Yet the ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki has proven remarkably popular, spawning countless books, documentaries and television shows. Why does this interpretation appeal to so many people? Perhaps because it offers a way to take ancient myths seriously, while fitting them into a modern technological worldview. Instead of dismissing the Anunnaki as mere superstitions, the ancient astronaut theory suggests they were real beings, just not divine ones. Instead of gods, they were advanced aliens, using technology that ancient humans interpreted as magic. The theory also appeals to a sense that human history is more mysterious and complex than mainstream narratives suggest, that there are hidden truths waiting to be discovered, that ancient peoples might have had access to knowledge or experiences that have been lost or suppressed. However, the ancient astronaut interpretation ultimately does a disservice to ancient Mesopotamian culture. It assumes that ancient people were incapable of sophisticated abstract thought, that they could only understand advanced technology as divine power. It takes myths that were rich in symbolic and theological meaning and reduces them to literal descriptions of alien encounters. The actual Mesopotamians understood their myths in complex, nuanced ways. They knew the difference between literal and metaphorical truth. They engaged in sophisticated theological debates about the nature of the gods, the structure of the cosmos, the relationship between divine and human realms. To read the Anunnaki myths as primitive accounts of alien visitation is to ignore this sophistication, to impose modern concerns and interpretations onto ancient texts that meant something quite different to their original audiences. Yet, there is something poignant about the modern fascination with ancient astronaut theories. It reflects a longing for connection with something greater than ourselves, for evidence that we are not alone in the universe, for hidden knowledge that might transform our understanding of human history and destiny. These are not so different from the concerns that motivated ancient Mesopotamians when they told stories about the Anunnaki. They too wondered about humanity's place in the cosmos, about our relationship with powers greater than ourselves, about the meaning of our existence and the legacy we would leave behind. The forms of these questions have changed over millennia, but the fundamental human impulse to wonder, to seek meaning, to tell stories that help us understand our place in the universe, that impulse remains constant, connecting us across the vast spans of time to those ancient priests who first pressed their styluses into clay tablets, recording the deeds of the gods. Chapter 21. Echoes in Later Traditions. The influence of Mesopotamian mythology, including the stories of the Anunnaki, extended far beyond the boundaries of ancient Iraq. As ideas, trade goods, and peoples moved across the ancient Near East, these myths travelled with them, influencing the religious and cultural traditions of neighbouring civilizations. The biblical flood narrative found in Genesis bears striking similarities to the earlier Mesopotamian flood myths. Noah parallels Utnapishtim or Atrahasis. The command to build an ark, to bring animals aboard, to wait for the waters to recede, all these elements appear in the earlier Mesopotamian versions. Scholars generally agree that the biblical authors were familiar with Mesopotamian flood traditions and adapted them for their own theological purposes. The Tower of Babel story in Genesis, with its description of humans attempting to build a tower reaching to heaven, likely reflects memories of Mesopotamian ziggurats. The confusion of languages in the biblical account may reference Babylon's cosmopolitan nature as a city where many different languages were spoken. Even some aspects of biblical angelology may have roots in Mesopotamian tradition. The concept of divine beings who serve as messengers and intermediaries between God and humanity parallels the role of lesser gods in Mesopotamian religion. The idea that these beings sometimes rebelled against divine authority echoes myths about conflicts among the Anunnaki. Greek mythology also shows possible Mesopotamian influence, though the connections are more debated. The Greek creation myth involving the castration of Uranus by Cronus bears some similarity to conflicts between generations of gods in Mesopotamian myth. The Greek underworld, ruled by Hades and Persephone, has parallels with the Mesopotamian underworld ruled by Ereshkigal and Nergal. Some scholars have suggested that the Greek hero Heracles may have been influenced by Mesopotamian heroes like Gilgamesh or the god Ninurta. Both Heracles and Gilgamesh were semi-divine heroes who performed great labours, who struggled with mortality, who travelled to distant lands and faced impossible challenges. The cultural exchange went both ways. During the Hellenistic period, after Alexander's conquests, Greek philosophical and religious ideas influenced Mesopotamian thought. Babylonian astronomers corresponded with Greek scholars, sharing observations and techniques. Religious syncretism produced hybrid deities that combined Greek and Mesopotamian attributes. Even after Mesopotamian civilization ended, its intellectual legacy continued through these cultural transmissions. Greek and Roman writers preserved some knowledge of Mesopotamian history and mythology, though often garbled or misunderstood. Medieval Islamic scholars studied ancient Mesopotamian astronomy and mathematics, preserving and building upon this knowledge. The rediscovery of cuneiform texts in the 19th century suddenly made available a vast library of original sources, allowing modern scholars to understand Mesopotamian civilization on its own terms rather than through the filter of later traditions. This has led to a renaissance in Mesopotamian studies, with new discoveries and interpretations constantly emerging. Today we can read the ancient myths in their original languages, study the archaeological remains of Mesopotamian cities, trace the complex development of religious ideas over thousands of years. The Anunnaki emerge not as aliens or demons, but as what they originally were, the gods of the world's first urban civilization, reflecting that civilization's values, fears, hopes, and understanding of the cosmos. Chapter 22. The Gift of Myth. As this long journey through ancient time draws toward its close, let us reflect on what these stories of the Anunnaki offer us today. Thousands of years after the last temple fell silent, the last tablet was pressed, the last prayer was spoken in Sumerian. These myths are not literal historical accounts. They were never meant to be. They are something richer, attempts by thoughtful people to make sense of existence, to answer the great questions that every human culture must address. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What is our relationship to the powers that shape our world? What happens when we die? The Mesopotamians answered these questions through stories of the Anunnaki, gods who created humanity to serve them, who sent the flood but also preserved survivors, who taught civilization's arts, who decreed fate but could also show mercy, who ruled from heaven but walked among mortals. these stories reveal a worldview quite different from our own. The Mesopotamians did not separate sacred from secular as we do. They did not see nature as a realm of blind physical forces operating according to mathematical laws. They experienced the world as alive, as imbued with divine presence, as meaningful in ways both terrible and beautiful. When a storm arose, it was Enlil expressing his anger. When rain fell after drought, it was divine mercy. When a king conquered his enemies, it was because Marduk had decreed his victory. When disease struck, it might be punishment for sin, or the arbitrary malice of demons, or simply the will of the gods, which mortals could not fully understand. This worldview could be comforting. You were never alone, never without divine attention, part of a cosmic order that was ultimately meaningful and purposeful. But it could also be terrifying. You were constantly under divine scrutiny, subject to forces you could not control, dependent on the favour of gods who could be capricious. Modern people often see themselves as more sophisticated, no longer needing such myths. We have science to explain natural phenomena, technology to control our environment, philosophies and psychologies to make sense of human nature. We don't need gods to explain thunder or disease, yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered by science and technology. We still wonder about meaning and purpose. We still struggle with mortality. We still seek connection with something greater than ourselves, whether we call it God, the universe, collective consciousness, or simply the mystery that cannot be fully captured in words. The myths of the Anunnaki remind us that humans have always grappled with these questions, that our ancestors were not simple or primitive, but were sophisticated thinkers who created elaborate systems of meaning to help them navigate existence. We may not believe in Anu, or Enlil or Inanna as literal entities, but we can appreciate the human wisdom embedded in their stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh's meditation on friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning, the flood myth's warnings about hubris and excess, Inanna's descent teaching that transformation requires descent into darkness, the creation myth's emphasis on order emerging from chaos, on the importance of maintaining cosmic balance. These themes are universal, transcending the specific cultural context in which they were first expressed. They speak to enduring aspects of the human condition, to experiences and insights that remain relevant across millennia. Chapter 23. The Eternal Return. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that time was cyclical rather than linear. The year turned through its seasons, death and rebirth following one another in endless succession. Kings came and went, dynasties rose and fell, but the cosmic order established by the Anunnaki at creation remained fundamentally unchanged. Each New Year festival reenacted the creation, richly returning society to the primordial moment when Marduk defeated Tiamat and established order. The king's authority was renewed, the sacred marriage was performed, the fates for the coming year were decreed in the divine assembly. Then the cycle would continue, moving through another year until the next New Year festival, when everything would be renewed again. This cyclical understanding of time is foreign to modern Western thought, which tends to see time as linear, as progress from past to future, as development towards some eventual culmination. But the Mesopotamian view has its own wisdom. If time is cyclical, then nothing is truly lost. Dumuzi dies but returns. The vegetation withers but grows again. Civilizations fall, but others rise. The patterns repeat endlessly, and within these repeating patterns, human life finds its meaning not in unique, unrepeatable progress, but in faithful participation in eternal rhythms. The rituals performed in Mesopotamian temples were not simply commemorating events that happened once long ago. They were participating in these events, making them present again, accessing the sacred time when gods and mortals interacted directly, when the boundaries between heaven and earth were permeable. When a priest performed the daily ritual of feeding and clothing a divine statue, he was not merely honouring a memory but was participating in the ongoing relationship between gods and humans, a relationship established at creation and renewed daily through ritual action. This understanding of ritual as participation rather than commemoration gave extraordinary weight to religious practice. The correct performance of rituals was not optional, not merely symbolic. It was essential for maintaining cosmic order, for ensuring that the sun would rise, the rivers would flow, the crops would grow, civilization would continue. If the rituals were neglected, if the offerings ceased, If the temples fell into disrepair, then cosmic order itself would be threatened. The gods might withdraw their favour. The forces of chaos might return. Civilization might collapse. This was not mere superstition. It reflected a profound understanding that human culture and social order are fragile achievements, constantly threatened by natural disasters, warfare, internal conflict, and simple neglect. Maintaining civilization requires constant effort, constant renewal, constant attention to the rituals and practices that bind communities together and connect them to their founding values and traditions. The Anunnaki represented these founding values, these cosmic principles that needed to be honoured and maintained. Their myths were not entertainment, but were essential teachings, passed from generation to generation, reminding people of their place in the cosmic order and their responsibilities to maintain it. When cuneiform writing was lost, when the rituals ceased, when the temples crumbled, something precious was indeed lost. Not because the gods literally departed, but because the cultural memory and wisdom encoded in those myths and rituals were no longer accessible, no longer part of living tradition. Chapter 24. Dreamtime. Your breathing has slowed now, deepened. Your body is heavy, relaxed, sinking into comfort. The story of the Anunnaki has woven itself through your consciousness like a thread of gold through ancient cloth, beautiful but abstract, real but dreamlike. This liminal space between waking and sleeping is not so different from the space the ancient Mesopotamians inhabited, where myths and reality intertwined, where the gods walked among mortals, where every moment held the potential for divine encounter. In dreams, we access realities that normal consciousness cannot reach. The boundaries become permeable. The impossible becomes possible. Time flows differently. Causality operates according to different rules. We meet beings who exist only in the dream realm, yet they seem utterly real while we encounter them. Perhaps this is what the ancient Mesopotamians meant when they spoke of the gods. Not literal beings with physical bodies dwelling in the sky, but powers and presences accessible in altered states of consciousness, in vision and dream, in ritual and trance, in the moments when normal awareness gives way to something deeper, stranger, more numinous. The priests and priestesses who tended the temples, who performed the daily rituals, who interpreted omens and dreams, they were specialists in navigating these liminal spaces, in maintaining the connection between ordinary reality and the sacred dimension that gave it meaning. When they said they encountered the gods, they were not lying or deluded. They were reporting genuine experiences, using the language and concepts available to them, interpreting what they experienced through the lens of their culture and theology. We might use different language today. We might speak of the collective unconscious, of archetypal energies, of transpersonal dimensions of consciousness. But we are speaking of similar experiences, moments when the boundaries of the ordinary self become permeable, when we touch something greater than our individual ego, when we participate in meanings that transcend our personal story. The Anunnaki, in this understanding, are not ancient aliens or obsolete superstitions, but are living archetypes, patterns of meaning that remain active in the human psyche. When we read their myths, we are not studying dead history, but are encountering living symbols that still speak to us, still have power to move and transform us. Enlil as the principle of authority and order, Enki as the principle of wisdom and crafty intelligence, Inanna as the principle of life, death, and transformation. Marduk as the hero who defeats chaos and establishes civilization. These are not just characters in ancient stories, but are dimensions of human experience, aspects of the soul, powers we can recognize in ourselves and in the world. Let these images drift through your mind as sleep approaches. The ziggurat rising from the desert, the two rivers flowing toward the sea, the divine assembly decreeing fate, the floodwaters rising and receding, the hero seeking immortality, the goddess descending to the underworld, the king performing the sacred marriage, the scribe pressing stylus into clay, preserving wisdom for future generations. These are humanity's dreams, shaped into story, given form in myth, preserved across millennia. And now they become your dreams, as you slip into sleep, as consciousness fades into the mystery that claims us all each night. That small death from which we wake each morning, renewed, ready to participate once more in the eternal cycle. Chapter 25. The End and the Beginning. All stories must end, even stories, of the gods who ruled before time was measured, who shaped the world from the body of chaos, who decreed the fates of nations and civilizations. The Anunnaki are no longer worshipped. Their temples are ruins. Their priests are long dead. Their language is studied only by specialists. Yet something of them remains, preserved in the myths we have explored together, in the archaeological remnants of their civilization, in the echoes of their influence on later traditions. And perhaps most importantly, they remain in the questions they asked and the answers they offered. The same questions we still ask, the answers we still seek in our own ways. Where did we come from? They answered, from the blood and clay of the gods created to serve but given the arts of civilization, capable of building great cities, composing beautiful poetry, contemplating our own existence. Why are we mortal? They answered. Because immortality belongs to the gods alone, because death gives meaning to life, because our works and legacies can outlast our bodies even if we cannot. How should we live? They answered, honour the gods, maintain justice, preserve wisdom, create beauty, build cities that will endure, participate in the great patterns that connect heaven and earth. What happens when we die? They answered. We go to the dust and darkness, diminished but not destroyed, dependent on the living to remember us, to speak our names, to pour libations that sustain us in the shadowy realm below. These answers may not satisfy us today. We seek different solutions to the eternal questions. But the questions remain, as urgent and necessary now as they were 5,000 years ago, when the first myths of the Anunnaki were sung beneath Mesopotamian stars. And so, we continue the great conversation that began in ancient Sumer, that has continued through all the civilizations that have risen and fallen since then, that will continue as long as humans exist to wonder about our place in the cosmos. The Anunnaki sleep now in the earth, buried beneath the ruins of their temples, but perhaps in some sense they never die. Perhaps they live on in every story told, every question asked, every attempt to make meaning from the mystery of existence. Perhaps they live on in you, as you drift into sleep, as ancient patterns and primordial images flow through your dreaming mind, as you participate once more in the eternal drama of consciousness, seeking to understand itself. Rest now. Sleep deeply. The rivers flow on through the land between them. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient courses. The world turns through its seasons. And you, like the countless millions who have come before, like the countless millions yet to come, take your place in the great pattern, the cosmic order established at creation, renewed each day, eternal and ever-changing. May your dreams be peaceful. May your rest be deep. May you wake refreshed, ready to take up again your part in the continuing story of humanity, that story which began so long ago in the land between two rivers, when the gods walked among mortals and civilization was born. Sleep well, weary traveller. The ancient ones watch over you still.